Think of the Mandela Effect. For a huge number of people, Nelson Mandela's death in the 1980s is vivid. I've had friends describe watching his funeral on television, hearing the announcements on the radio, or being taught about it in school. None of those memories line up with history. Mandela was released from prison, later became South Africa's president, and died decades afterwards. That mismatch is powerful because it reveals how collective memory forms not from precise recordings but from what feels narratively true. When a recollection fits the emotional logic we already carry, loss, closure, moral consequence, the mind accepts it without pausing to verify facts. The Mandela Memory teaches a humbling truth. Our minds are meaning-making engines, not perfect tapes. Where information fades, they invent what seems plausible, weaving gaps into coherent stories we then share as if they were facts. So next time someone recalls a vivid but false public moment, don't mock them. It's proof our memories prioritize meaning over exact detail. Take the Berenstain Bears, a tiny spelling difference turned into one of the internet's favorite mysteries. Ask a room full of people what the name is and a surprising number will say, with complete confidence, Berenstein, with an E. Except the books and author credit have always said Berenstain, with an A. That single vowel swap has spawned everything from earnest amateur physicists claiming sliding timelines to late-night internet threads talking about parallel universes. I'll admit it, I used to be in the Berenstein camp. I can still see the covers in my head, the cozy little bear house and the way Mama Bear looks at the kids. And in that memory, the name ends in Stein. When I first learned the correct spelling, it felt weirdly like a tiny betrayal, as if someone had quietly edited my childhood. If you felt the same, you're not alone, and that feeling is actually part of the story. Psychologists explain this with something much less exotic, but a lot more plausible: memory normalization. Our brains are prediction machines. When we encounter information that's uncommon or slightly odd, our brain often corrects it into something more familiar. The suffix Stein shows up a lot in English names: Einstein, Bernstein, Goldstein. So when people read or heard Berenstain as a child, their minds frequently defaulted to the more familiar Stein. It's not malice or conspiracy, it's pattern recognition doing what it does best. Add to that the way most of us experienced those books, as kids focused on the stories, the pictures, the lessons, not on the precise spelling of the author's name on the cover. Attention is a surprisingly scarce resource. While you're absorbed in the story about a bear learning to share or facing a new fear, the title or surname doesn't get encoded into memory in high detail. Years later, when you try to recall it, your brain fills in the gaps with the most likely option. And because Stein feels right, that's what you remember. Finally, there's the illusion of certainty. Memories feel vivid and authoritative even when they're reconstructed. You can be absolutely sure you remember an E and still be wrong. That confidence, combined with the social reinforcement of hearing others say the same thing, turns a small misremembering into a widespread phenomenon. So the Berenstein debate is a neat case study. Childhood attention focused elsewhere, linguistic expectation nudging us toward a common pattern, and the brain's tendency to smooth and fill in details. It's less about alternate realities and more about how ordinary memory works: messy, impressionistic, and surprisingly social. Next, we'll look at another famous example where the same mixture of low attention and expectation leads people to remember something very differently than the record shows. Most people, me included, have been saying for decades, "Luke, I am your father." It's so lodged in our heads that it barely feels like a misquote at all. But in the movie, the line is actually, "No, I am your father." Two tiny words different, and suddenly the whole thing looks different when you go back and listen. Why does that happen? Part of it is about isolation. In the film, that moment is part of a charged exchange. Luke says something, Vader answers, the music swells, the camera cuts. The actual phrase sits inside a scene, not as a billboard-ready sentence. When we pull a line out of its original setting and use it on its own, in conversation, in a meme, as a punchline, we naturally add context to make it make sense. Saying "No, I am your father" at a party without setting up who I or your refers to feels confusing. Slap Luke in front and everyone knows exactly what you mean. That added clarity makes the line more shareable and stickier. Then add repetition. Parodies, TV commercials, impressionists, and late-night hosts all went straight to the simpler, clearer version. It's easier for a comedian to deliver "Luke, I am your father" in 40 seconds of sketch than to recreate the whole Vader-Luke exchange. Over time, those public echoes do more than remind us. They overwrite the original. Each time someone repeats the misquote with confidence, it nudges the collective memory a little further away from the source. This is the engine of the Mandela Effect, a culturally reinforced memory that diverges from documented reality. It's not mystical, it's social. When thousands of people hear and share the same wrong version, it starts to feel like the real one. Our brains are wired to favor coherent, context-rich snippets that are easy to recall and pass on. The version that's clearest in everyday speech is the one that wins. It's also personal. Think about the movies and lines you learned outside the theater, shouted across a playground, used to make someone laugh, typed into a comment thread. The lines you quote most adapt to the way you and your group need them to function. I can remember being 13 and dropping "Luke, I am your father" to get a laugh, and the laugh reinforced the phrase every single time after. That emotional reinforcement is powerful. Memory isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction that favors utility and social currency. So next time you confidently spout a famous line, pause for a second, not to correct anyone, but to marvel. Our shared culture keeps remixing itself, and sometimes the remix becomes the new original. Which misquoted line do you catch yourself saying without thinking? The Monopoly Man's monocle. Take the Monopoly Man as a perfect little example. Chances are you can picture him right now, top hat, twirled mustache, cane, and, for a surprising number of people, a monocle. It feels so real that when someone points out he never wore one, they sound wrong. I used to be certain he did, until I saw an old Monopoly board and realized my memory was filling in that single round glass. Why does that happen? Because monocles are shorthand for a certain kind of wealthy caricature. Think Mr. Peanut, those Victorian bankers in period dramas, caricatured aristocrats in cartoons. The monocle is an easy visual cue for old money. Our brains learn those cues and then, later, when we're asked to recall a character who fits the wealthy, mustachioed gentleman archetype, they sew together bits from different images until they produce a complete picture that makes sense. We don't remember only what we actually saw, we remember what our stereotype-driven expectations supply. This blending of details has a name: memory conflation. It's when memories from separate experiences merge into one cohesive but false recollection. Instead of preserving each source as distinct, the brain extracts the common theme and fills gaps with the most prototypical features. The more a detail matches the stereotype, the stronger the association between monocles and wealthy gents in this case, the more confidently the mind treats that detail as if it were actually seen. That's why these false memories can feel so vivid. When I tell this story on the street, half the people I ask will argue with me, insisting they remember the monocle in bright, specific terms. They might even supply the exact scene where they saw it. It's not lying or poor attention. It's the brain doing what it's built to do: compress information into patterns and shortcuts so we can navigate the world quickly. Unfortunately, shorthand is lossy. It discards some specifics and fills in others. You probably have your own examples. A song lyric you sang wrong for years, a childhood toy you swore had a feature it didn't, or a celebrity role you misremembered because it fit their usual persona. Those are snippets of the same process in action. Memory conflation isn't about being forgetful. It's a byproduct of an efficient, pattern-seeking mind that prefers a coherent story to messy, incomplete details. So next time you're certain you remember something that everyone else disputes, don't be embarrassed. You're just experiencing a common human shortcut. And as you start noticing these moments, you'll see how often your assumptions, not your eyesight, are doing the remembering for you. Next up, the fruit of the Loom cornucopia, probably the most argued about piece of non-existent logo furniture on the internet. Ask a group of people to picture the fruit of the Loom emblem, and a surprising number will insert a little wicker horn spilling fruit all over the place. The kicker? Fruit of the Loom never, ever included a cornucopia in its logo. Why do so many of us swear it did? It's a neat example of how memory is less like a camera and more like a story we keep editing. In Western visual culture, cornucopias and fruit go together. Paintings, holiday centerpieces, old-fashioned still lifes. Whenever artists wanted to signal abundance, they stuck a horn of plenty next to a pile of fruit. That repeated pairing builds a mental shortcut. Fruit plus decorative display equals cornucopia. So when you see fruit in a logo, your brain almost automatically adds the horn, even if it wasn't there to begin with. There's another layer to this. Look at packaging design from the 1970s and 80s. Grocery items, canned fruit, jam labels, and even sock boxes favored illustrated fruit arranged in decorative shapes. Baskets, draped vines, little decorative bowls. Those compositions often imply a container without explicitly drawing one. If your childhood memories include grocery shelves, magazine ads, or the boxes in your parents' laundry closet, you've probably soaked up thousands of images where fruit sat in a decorative context. Later, when you try to recall a simple logo, your brain borrows from that bank of related images and tucks a cornucopia into the scene. I'll be honest, I used to argue about this with my uncle. I could clearly see a horn of plenty behind those grapes. He insisted it was my imagination. When we finally looked up the trademark art together, I felt oddly embarrassed. Except not really, because the memory felt so vivid. That's the point. Vivid doesn't equal accurate. Memories are constructive. They're made from fragments, expectations, and cultural schemas. Your mind fills in what seems to belong. Cognitive psychologists call this top-down processing. Instead of building perception purely from sensory input, the brain applies expectations and prior knowledge to interpret what it sees. And sometimes it fills gaps entirely. That's why two people can have the same experience but come away with different recollections. One person remembers a cornucopia, another remembers plain piled fruit. Both are working from the same mental rulebook that says fruit in art often has a horn, and one of them simply applies that rule where it doesn't belong. So the next time someone swears the fruit of the Loom logo included a cornucopia, don't dismiss them as dishonest or deluded. They're not making it up maliciously. They're doing what brains do, simplifying, symbol matching, and editing scenes to fit cultural expectations. It's a fascinating quirk of human memory, and a reminder that our minds prefer coherent stories to cold photographic accuracy. Think about the Snow White line for a second. If you grew up with the story, chances are you can hear it in your head right now. Mirror, mirror on the wall. But here's the twist. The original line in the Brothers Grimm tale and in Disney's animated film is actually magic mirror on the wall. Weird, right? I remember being absolutely certain it was mirror, mirror for years. I even corrected friends when they said magic. Then I watched the clip and felt like someone had quietly moved a piece of furniture in my childhood bedroom. So why does the wrong version hang on so stubbornly? It's less about malice and more about how our brains prefer sound. Mirror, mirror has repetition and alliteration, two very powerful memory tricks. The repeated word creates a rhythm, and that rhythm is catchy. Say, mirror, mirror, out loud. It has a musical quality. Magic mirror is fine, but it doesn't have the same punch. Humans are wired to remember patterns and sounds faster than dry, factual detail. A line that rolls off the tongue is simply easier to store and retrieve. Then there's the social factor. Pop culture tends to favor the punchier version. Parodies, memes, stand-up comedians, they pick the wording that lands with the audience. As soon as a slightly altered phrase gains traction, you hear it everywhere. The next time you think of Snow White, your brain reaches for the most readily available, most aesthetic version of that line. Over time, the catchier version crowds out the original in collective memory. This process is basically what people mean when they talk about the Mandela Effect. It's not just about one mistaken line, it's about how groups of people can strongly remember something that didn't happen the way they recall. In many cases, what's being favored is not accuracy, but aesthetic recall, how pleasing or memorable the sound or structure is. The mind will override small, factual details if the alternative is neater, funnier, or more rhythmic. I find this comforting in a way. It means my brain's not failing me, it's optimizing. But it's also a little humbling. We like to think memory is a faithful recorder. In reality, it's more like an editor, constantly rewriting to make the story flow better or sound better. So the next time you're certain a famous line went one way, pause for a second and check. You might be surprised, and you might also enjoy that your memory chose the catchiest version for you. Which version do you hear first? Mirror, mirror, or magic mirror? Say it in the comments. I'd love to see how many of us are choir members for the same lyric in our heads. Looney Tunes or Looney Tunes. Funny thing about little details, they sneak into our brains and set camp there. Take the old cartoon classics. So many people are convinced the title was Looney Tunes. I was one of them. I can still picture myself in 3rd grade handwriting a poster that read Looney Tunes because, well, that's what made sense. You watch cartoon characters, so of course they're tunes. But the official title has always been Looney Tunes, Tunes. Why? Because the series grew out of a tradition of musical shorts. Studios like Warner Brothers were producing pieces very much in the vein of merry melodies, and tunes called back to that musical heritage. The cartoons often used popular songs, orchestral cues, and music-driven gags, so the name was as much a branding choice as an artistic nod. The connection was obvious to the folks making the shorts. To viewers, it rarely registered, especially once cartoons became the dominant mental template. This is where psychology comes in. Our brains love patterns and shortcuts. When we hear cartoon, the phonetic chunk toon is primed. So if you're trying to remember a show with zany characters, Looney Tunes fits effortlessly. Memory isn't a video recorder, it's constructive. When expectation and reality diverge, expectation often wins. If something feels more logical, even if it's incorrect, your mind will store that altered version because it reduces cognitive dissonance. It's the same reason people are sure the Monopoly man has a monocle, he doesn't, or why lyrics get misheard on pop songs. The version that feels clean and consistent tends to stick. There's also social reinforcement. If your friends, your sibling, and a dozen comment threads all say Toons, that collective agreement strengthens the false memory. I remember arguing with my cousin until we finally looked it up together and felt a little sheepish, then fascinated when we learned the truth. That moment is relatable. We're all guilty of confidently repeating details that sound right. So next time you instinctively type TOONS, pause and picture the old Merry Melodies title cards and orchestral stings. It's a neat reminder that names carry histories, and our brains will rewrite facts to fit familiar stories unless we check the original source. You probably heard "life is like a box of chocolates" so many times it sounds wrong the other way. I certainly did. For years I quoted it aloud, and only when I watched Forrest Gump again did I freeze. The line is actually, "Life was like a box of chocolates." That little "was" feels off, and that's exactly the point. Our brains are built to prefer what sounds natural. Present tense generalizations, "life is," are how we typically summarize rules or truths. Past tense snapshots, "life was," make the sentence feel like a one-time reflection. tied to a moment in the movie. Expectancy bias steps in. Our memories drift toward the wording that best fits our expectations and how language usually works. We remember the idea perfectly. The exact phrasing gets nudged into the shape our minds like better. This happens to everyone. Think about song lyrics you were sure you knew until you saw the real words. We built this city on sausage rolls. Or people who swear the little yellow M&M is named Melvin. Those are small, funny examples of the same thing. Memory is reconstructive, not a tape recorder. When something fits a pattern, common grammar, a neat rhyme, or a widely repeated paraphrase, our brains rewrite the original to match. Culture amplifies that rewrite. Once enough people start saying, "Life is like a box of chocolates," on posters, in memes, at weddings, the altered version becomes the norm. The original starts to feel wrong, almost unbelievable. This is why so many Mandela Effect cases have social reinforcement at their core. Repeated versions crowd out the source. When millions of people echo the same phrasing, the collective memory tips. What began as a small slip becomes the default. I remember arguing with a friend about this exact quote after seeing it on a t-shirt. She insisted Forrest said is. I insisted he said was. We both pulled out our phones and watched a clip, and felt surprisingly surprised. That tiny moment made me aware of how confidently I can be wrong about words I've said 1,000 times. Understanding expectancy bias isn't just trivia, it's practical. It helps explain why eyewitness testimony can be unreliable, why you might swear you locked the door when you didn't, and why family stories morph over generations until nobody recognizes the original. The fix isn't shame, it's curiosity. Pause the next time you're sure about a famous line. Look it up. Notice the small difference. Think about why your mind preferred one version. So when you hear the is version next, there's a backstory. Human brains smoothing rough edges, social echoes cementing the smoother line, and a million tiny corrections that make the altered quote feel like truth. And honestly, whether is or was, the meaning is still the same. But the example is a neat reminder that memory favors what makes sense, not what actually happened. Have you ever squinted at a candy wrapper and been absolutely sure there used to be a hyphen? I know I have. For years, I could have sworn the chocolate-covered wafer came labeled Kit Kat with a tiny dash between the words. I would point it out to friends like it was evidence in some small cultural mystery. Then someone would pull up an old photo and, surprise, the hyphen wasn't there. That little mental knot is a perfect example of how our brains tidy up visuals. So where did that phantom dash come from? A lot of it comes down to context and habit. In the past, many brands and packaging styles leaned on hyphens. Think of older product names or signs where a dash made the label look balanced and tidy. If your formative memories of supermarket shelves include those kinds of designs, your brain gets used to that pattern. When it encounters a similar-looking logo that lacks a hyphen, the mind sometimes supplies one automatically because it looks right. Symmetry and neatness feel complete. There's also a visual reason tied to the logo itself. The Kit Kat mark has strong, blocky lettering and a clear break between the two syllables. That separation can read as a place where a hyphen might live. Add to that the power of repetition. If you see the two parts of the word as separate in other contexts, you'll be more likely to mentally insert the dash. Combine that with social reinforcement, friends who remember the hyphen, memes, or casual online debates, and the false memory solidifies. I like to think of this as a small, everyday example of our tendency to prefer closure. Designers rely on that. Our eyes notice patterns, and we subconsciously complete missing pieces. When a design feels unfinished, the mind steps in to correct it. It's the same reason people remember song lyrics the way they think they should go, or why we misplace tiny details of a familiar face. Memory is not a camera. It's an editor that smooths edges and fills gaps. If you're tempted to dig through old family photos to prove your point, go ahead. Those images are great for settling playful arguments. But also take a moment to be curious about how your brain organized that memory in the first place. It's not a mistake so much as a peek into the shorthand our minds use to make sense of a busy visual world. And honestly, whether there's a dash or not, I'll still reach for the same four-fingered chocolate fix when the craving hits. The Pikachu tail stripe. I remember being convinced for years that Pikachu's tail had a black tip. When I was a kid, that little dark end felt iconic, like the finishing touch that made Pikachu unmistakable. So when someone first told me, no, that's wrong, I felt a weird, sinking disbelief, like a small part of my past had been edited. Turns out the truth is simpler. Pikachu's tail has a brown patch at the base, not a black stripe at the end. There has never been a black-tipped tail in the official design. Why do so many of us remember it differently? A big part of the answer is character mashups. In a world where dozens of electric-type rodents and fox-like creatures exist across games, cartoons, toys, and fan art, visual features blur together. Some Pokemon do have distinct tail markings or tips, and our brains are excellent at borrowing familiar details and stitching them onto other familiar faces. Mix that with years of seeing distorted images and low-quality merch, and it's no wonder a false detail becomes just as real as the original. Merchandise plays a surprisingly large role. Early Pikachu plushes, factory-produced toys, and knockoff products often used inconsistent inks, cheap dyes, or sloppy painting. I still remember a plush I had with a darker smudge on the tail's edge, enough to convince me that everyone else saw it too. Add to that coloring books, stickers, and promotional art that sometimes shaded or outlined the tail differently, and you get a patchwork of visuals that train a memory that wasn't quite accurate. This is a classic example of what people call the Mandela Effect, where a large group shares the same false memory. What's important is not the spectre of conspiracy, but what it reveals about memory itself. Childhood memories, especially those tied to iconic characters, are particularly susceptible to reconstruction. Little details are fragile. When we try to recall them years later, our minds fill gaps with whatever seems plausible. Other characters, the toys we owned, or the way our friends described things. That's why the Pikachu tail story is so relatable. It's not about being wrong. It's about how we build vivid narratives from imperfect pieces. If you've ever argued with someone over a tiny detail from a favorite show or debated a logo's color and felt sure you were right, you've lived this too. The next time an odd memory nags at you, try tracing it. Look at official artwork, check old photos, and you'll often find how many different sources shaped what you remembered. We are the champions of the world. If you've ever belted out Queen at a wedding, a funeral, or that karaoke night you promised you wouldn't sing, you probably finished the last line the same way everyone else does. We are the champions of the world. It feels inevitable, like punctuation to a sentence. So imagine the surprise the first time I learned the album version actually drops those two words. It ends on, "We are the champions," and then silence. I remember thinking, no way, that can't be right. Because my brain had been so certain for years that the song finished with that triumphant crowning phrase. That gut certainty makes total sense once you think about how the song is structured. Freddie Mercury does sing of the world earlier in the chorus, and in countless live recordings and covers, he wraps the whole thing up with those words. You've heard that version 100 times. Radio edits, stadium sing-alongs, mashups, TikToks, they all reinforce the same hook. So when the studio cut leaves the phrase off, your memory fills it in. More than that, the melody and cadence create a sense of closure that practically invites of the world to land there. Our brains don't like loose ends in music any more than they like loose ends in conversation. This is a textbook example of how predictive completion works in the brain. Listening isn't passive. We're constantly guessing what comes next. The next word, the next chord, the next beat. And when the actual input aligns with our prediction, we feel satisfaction. When it doesn't, We often edit the reality in our heads to match the prediction anyway. So even if the audio track stops short, the internal soundtrack carries on. That internal addition feels just as real as if you had actually heard it, because perception and memory are built from the same predictive machinery. This is also why the "we are the champions" moment has become a music-specific Mandela effect. People share the exact same false memory. They remember a definitive last line that isn't there on the studio recording. The phenomenon spreads easily in social contexts, at parties, online comment threads, and in family arguments. So the mistaken line becomes part of the cultural script. I'll never forget arguing with a friend over dinner about whether Queen left those words off. Both of us were so confident we were right that looking up the track felt like pulling a rug out from under our memories. It's comforting to realize this isn't about faulty hearing or intentional trickery. It's a feature of how our brains make sense of sound. Musicians and producers even play with this, knowing listeners will anticipate certain cadences. And once a phrase like "of the world" is cemented by repetition, live shows, greatest hits compilations, YouTube commentaries, the collective memory ossifies. That's why music-induced Mandela effects are so sticky. They combine emotion, repetition, and a brain wired to predict. Next, we'll unpack another famous musical misremembering and how a simple expectation can turn a tiny omission into a global memory. Remember that tiny moment in the supermarket when you squint at the cleaning aisle and think, "Is it Febreze or Febreeze?" You're not alone. I've caught myself second-guessing that double E more times than I care to admit. Millions do. The company spells it Febreeze, but our brains often see Febreeze, and there's a tidy reason for that. English loves doubling vowels to show a long sound. Think of words like coffee, cheese, sea. The repeated vowel visually reinforces the way we say the word. When you hear breeze, your mental spelling template wants to match the sound with familiar patterns, so a double E looks right. It's not laziness, it's pattern recognition at work. Our minds are wired to fill gaps using the most probable rule we've learned, and doubling a vowel to indicate that elongated E sound is a very probable rule. Brands know this, and sometimes they deliberately break the rule. Dropping a letter can make a name more distinctive or easier to trademark. Febreeze is a branding choice, a shorter visual shape, a fresh take, and a name that hints at breeze without following the usual spelling conventions. From a marketing perspective, it's clever, and from a memory perspective, it's uncanny. The mismatch triggers what cognitive psychologists call normalization. When input doesn't match a template, our memory edits it to the expected form. It gets personal because we all do this with other brand names too. Think of Snickers versus Snikers, or the way people insert an extra syllable into AOL when trying to remember it more clearly. I remember once writing a shopping list that said Febreze, convinced I was right, until I saw the bottle on the shelf and felt slightly betrayed. It's funny and human. Our language habits are so deeply embedded that even strong visual cues like a logo sometimes lose their battle with expectation. Try a quick experiment next time you shop. Before you pick up the bottle, look at the logo for a couple of seconds, then close your eyes and spell it mentally. If your brain adds an extra E, give yourself a little mental high five. Your language instincts did exactly what they're supposed to do. The brand didn't fail you, it just took a different route. So when you say Febreeze out loud, you're following the sound. When you see Febreeze on the bottle, you're seeing a compromise between language and branding. Both versions tell the same story. We love patterns, and when those patterns are nudged, our memories politely try to fix them. Jif or Jiffy peanut butter. Remember arguing with a friend or family member over something that felt obvious, then suddenly realizing you were both sure about something that never actually happened? That's the Jif versus Jiffy peanut butter situation, and it's a great little window into how our memories get braided together. Here's the plain fact. There has never been a national peanut butter brand called Jiffy. The real brand is Jif. Yet ask a room full of people whether they remember buying Jiffy peanut butter as a kid, and a surprising number will raise their hands like it's a shared childhood relic. I know. I once got into a heated debate with my cousin about family lunches because she swore the jar read Jiffy. We both reached for the same memory, and it felt undeniably real. So why does this happen? It's partly because our brains are built to make associations, to fill in gaps so we can move fast. Think about the ingredients that go into that false memory. Jif, the real brand. Skippy, another popular name in the same product category. And the phrase, in a jiffy, which everybody has heard 1,000 times. Those three things live close together in the mental filing cabinet labeled peanut butter quick snack. Over time, the labels get fuzzy at the edges and the items blend. Jif plus Skippy plus in a jiffy equals Jiffy. It's neat, sticky, and completely made up, but it feels authentic because every component is familiar. Commercial environments make this easy. Walk down a grocery aisle and you'll see dozens of jars with similar shapes, lid colors, fonts, and smiling mascots. Radio jingles and TV ads use catchy words and rhythms that lodge in your head. Logos and packaging are designed to be memorable, which is great for selling peanut butter, and equally great at making memories overlap. When you're repeatedly exposed to related names and images in the same context, your brain starts to compress them together to save space and effort. That's how overlapping memory spaces are formed. There's also another layer, conversational reinforcement. When other people mention Jiffy in passing, maybe in a comment thread or while reminiscing, your own memory can adjust to match theirs. Humans are social learners. Our memories are malleable, especially when the alternative is to be the odd one out in a group who all share the same recollection. So what's the takeaway? First, it's totally normal to have these blended memories. It doesn't mean you're forgetful or that history is rewriting itself. Second, it's a reminder that brands and language shape not just our purchases, but our sense of the past. Marketing doesn't just sell a product, it helps stitch together cultural memory. And sometimes that stitching creates seams that weren't really there. If you're wondering whether your own childhood snack aisle had more imaginary brands than real ones, you're probably not wrong. Next time you find yourself sure about something that can't be verified, take a beat. Ask someone else, check a label, and smile at how creative your memory can be. And hey, did you remember Jiffy before I said anything, or did I just plant that idea? And then there's the classic mix-up that trips up more people than you'd think. Oscar Mayer versus Oscar Meyer. Everyone seems to remember it one way, Meyer, but the company's name is actually spelled M-A-Y-E-R. Why does that happen so often? Because our brains are lazy in the nicest possible way. I can't tell you how many times I wrote Meyer on grocery lists growing up. I'd be in the lunch aisle staring at those packages of hot dogs, humming the jingle, and my pen had already decided the name ended with E-Y-E-R. It wasn't stubbornness, it was phonetics. When you say Meyer out loud, it sounds like Meyer, and in English that sound gets mapped to several plausible spellings in your head. Meyer, Meyer, even Meyer. Our internal spelling system defaults to what looks familiar, not what's historically correct. There's also the fact that many surnames of German origin can be spelled any of those ways, and all of them are common enough that your memory has seen them before. So when your brain reconstructs the name from sound, it leans on pattern recognition. This sounds like a name I know, so I'll pick that familiar pattern. That's why whole groups of people can confidently remember a brand name the wrong way. It's just efficient, phonetic logic over careful letter-by-letter recall. This kind of misremembering is a harmless little trick, but it's interesting because it shows how unreliable our memory can be when sound and spelling don't line up neatly. You're not alone if you've typed Meyer into Google and been puzzled when the top results point to Meyer. It's the same reason you might instinctively write February instead of February, or spell definitely as definitely. Our ears and our spelling habits don't always match. If you want a quick fix for future grocery runs, try a tiny visual anchor. Picture the red logo with the bold white letters, M-A-Y-E-R. Or imagine the founder, Oscar F. Mayer, signing his name with that particular vowel. Visualizing the exact lettering is usually enough to override the phonetic shortcut. And if you ever need to prove it in a debate, pull out a hot dog package or their website. Seeing the name in print reinforces the correct spelling much faster than arguing about how it sounds. So next time you find yourself writing Meyer from memory, give yourself a little mental nudge. You heard Meyer, you just spelled it the way your brain thought it should be. That mix-up tells a neat story about how our minds prioritize sound and familiarity. Not a conspiracy, just human shorthand. Take C-3PO. If you asked most people to picture him, they'd describe gleaming gold from head to toe, a perfect, shiny protocol droid. I did that for years. Then, one lazy Saturday, I rewatched A New Hope and froze on a quick medium shot. His lower right leg was clearly silver. Not a scratch or a faded spot. Silver. I felt oddly betrayed. How had I confidently imagined an entirely gold droid for decades? That tiny inconsistency is a great doorway into how our memory actually works. When we store events in our heads, we don't copy every pixel of the world like a hard drive. Instead, our brain creates a tidy, simplified version of reality built around patterns and expectations. Most of us have a C-3PO schema. Protocol droids are gold, polished, aristocratic. Details that fit that schema get reinforced. Details that don't, like a mismatched silver leg, are treated as noise and often vanish from memory. This is called schema-driven recall. The brain prioritizes consistency over precision. You see this all the time in everyday life. Think about recalling your friend's jacket color at a party. If their usual coat is blue and they show up in green, you're likely to misremember blue later because it matches your mental template for them. Or consider how people insist the Monopoly man has a monocle, a small visual trait that fits a certain caricature of a wealthy gentleman, even though he doesn't. Our minds prefer a clean, coherent story to a messy one full of exceptions. There's also something comforting about that editing process. It's efficient. Remembering the gist, C-3PO is gold, is useful and usually correct. The cost shows up when we need precise details, especially with surprising or unusual elements. That silver leg didn't just disappear from movie footage, it disappeared from collective memory because it cohered less well with the stereotype most viewers held. What I love about this is how personal it feels. I've caught myself confidently correcting people about things I was completely wrong about. Not out of malice, but because my brain had already streamlined the story. And the more often a simplified version gets rehearsed, through conversation, memes, or even our own internal narration, the stronger it becomes. That's why when the odd detail resurfaces, it can feel like a small cognitive scandal. You're discovering a quirk of the world you never knew you'd missed. So next time you rewatch an old favorite or look at a childhood photo, keep an eye out for those tiny mismatches. They're not mistakes in the film. They're clues about how your mind prefers tidy patterns over messy truth. And sometimes, a silver leg is more revealing than a lightsaber. The Henry VIII turkey portrait. You've probably seen someone on the internet confidently insist that the famous portrait of Henry VIII holding a turkey leg is real. I did too. I remember a grainy meme in a group chat where Henry's hulking figure seemed to be clutching a gigantic drumstick, and for a second it felt like a shared, indisputable fact. It feels vivid. The king with his velvet doublet, one hand on his hip, the other brandishing a roasted leg as if asking, "More stuffing." But here's the kicker. No such painting exists. So where did that picture come from? The short answer is culture. Over decades, we've repeatedly seen parodies, sketches, cartoons, and Renaissance fair caricatures of Henry VIII that lean into a single, irresistible stereotype. The medieval monarch as big, loud, and perpetually feasting. Comedy shows and animated series often lampoon royalty by giving them exaggerated props, oversized goblets, helmets, and yes, giant turkey legs. Those images are funny and memorable. We keep seeing them, we laugh, and our brains begin to stitch them together with the real historical portraits we've seen in textbooks or museum slides. After enough repetition, the stitched-together version starts to feel like memory. There's also a visual reason the false image feels plausible. Hans Holbein's famous portraits of Henry present a very specific silhouette. Broad shoulders, a commanding pose, one hand resting near his waist. When you've repeatedly seen medieval figures in pop culture holding food or props, your mind can unconsciously swap a glove or a sword for a drumstick. Source memory, remembering the content but not where it came from, does the rest. We remember the picture of Henry holding something, but the something is borrowed from a sketch or a Saturday night sketch that we can't quite place. This is a classic case of a collective illusion, not one person inventing a lie, but 100 tiny cultural nudges pushing the same false detail into common view. It's similar to other Mandela Effect moments, except this one is explainable without paranormal theories. Comedy, visual shorthand, and our brain's love of neat, consistent stories create a historical memory that never happened. Why should this matter to you? Because it shows how easily our sense of the past can be shaped by entertainment and repetition. If I can confess, I believed that meme for a few years. I only stopped when I was researching portraits and saw Holbein's real work up close. No turkey leg, just authority, ornament, and complete absence of poultry. It's a small thing, a laughable misremembering, but it's also a useful reminder to ask where our memories come from. Next time you're certain about a quirky historical detail, pause for a second. A viral joke might be masquerading as a fact. The Sinbad Genie movie. A lot of people insist they remember a 1990s family movie called Shazam where Sinbad played a genie, complete with a turban, a striped vest, and cheesy special effects. They can describe posters, lines of dialogue, even a vague memory of a cable TV promo. Here's the thing. That movie never existed. What happened is a classic case of memory contamination. How did so many of us come to share the same false memory? Start with two very real pieces. Sinbad, a comedian who often wore colourful, exotic costume looks on TV and at charity events in the 90s, and Kazam, the 1996 movie where Shaquille O'Neal plays a boombox-wielding genie. Those separate images, Sinbad in costume here, Shaq as a genie there, get tangled together. Our brains, which are designed to simplify and connect, fuse them into one neat but false narrative. Sinbad plus Genie movie equal Shazam. Psychologists call this source confusion or a source monitoring error. Memory isn't a video recorder, it's reconstructive. When you try to remember, your brain pulls together bits from different places, sights, conversations, feelings, and fills gaps with plausibly fitting details. If you've ever been absolutely certain you told someone something only to realize you only imagined telling them, you've felt source confusion firsthand. Social factors amplify the effect. Someone posts "Remember Shazam" online, friends jump in, a Reddit thread grows, and suddenly dozens of people start recalling the same non-existent poster or line. Rehearsal strengthens the memory. Imagining the scene or describing it aloud makes the fabricated memory feel more real. A phenomenon called imagination inflation. Add a splash of plausibility. Sinbad did wear stage costumes. Genies are a common movie trope, and the false memory becomes comfortably convincing. This mechanism is relatable because we all misremember small things all the time. Where we left our keys, the exact lyrics of a song, whether we closed a window. The Sinbad example is just the dramatic, public version. It's a reminder our memories are fallible, especially when different events overlap and get retold. So what can you do when your memory feels certain, but evidence disagrees? Pause before you double down. Check primary sources, clips, release lists, contemporaneous news, and be open to updating your memory. Treat vividness as a clue, not proof. And if you find you've misremembered, that's not a failure. It's the human mind at work. Now that we've seen how easily memories can merge into collective myths, let's unpack another famous example and what it reveals about the way we reconstruct the past: the Lindbergh baby mystery. Maybe you remember the story the same way I did growing up. A locked room riddle, a tiny child vanished into thin air, a nation left with only questions. For a lot of people, that memory has hardened into a simple belief that the Lindbergh kidnapping was never solved. It's a tidy, haunting idea, and it's the kind of story that sticks because it leaves room for speculation. But the historical record tells a different, messier truth. In reality, Charles Lindbergh's son was found, not alive but tragically deceased, and a man named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed for the crime. The body was discovered in May 1932. The investigation led to ransom notes, handwriting comparisons, and evidence tying a ladder and ransom money to Hauptmann. That legal resolution doesn't erase all the confusion or the controversy around the case, but it does mean that the core of the story wasn't an eternal mystery. There was a recovery, and there was a conviction. So why do so many of us remember it otherwise? A big part of the answer is how stories are filtered through the media and through time. Sensational headlines, selective retellings, and the appetite for open-ended mystery all do heavy lifting in shaping public memory. If a documentary emphasizes unanswered questions, or a podcast dwells on competing theories, those impressions can eclipse the basic facts we once learned. I know I absorbed bits and pieces from dramatic reenactments and late-night true crime chatter, and over time, the uncertainty became the headline in my mind. Another reason is human nature. Unresolved narratives are stickier. We pay more attention to riddles than to conclusions, especially when the conclusion is uncomfortable. Saying, "This was solved but it was horrible and complicated," doesn't have the same dramatic pull as "this remains baffling." Add to that the later debates about evidence and whether the trial was fair, valid concerns that invite doubt, and you've got a perfect environment for myth-making. This matters because the distortion isn't just trivia. It affects how we remember people and events. Treating resolved tragedies as unsolved can obscure the suffering of victims, the work of investigators, and the legal processes that followed. It can also make us less careful consumers of history. As we keep going, let's keep one eye on how stories transform over time, and the other on the facts themselves. Next, we'll look at another case where public memory has tilted the truth and unpack how that happened. I used to say Sex in the City without thinking about it. And I'd bet you've heard other people say it too. It's one of those tiny collective mistakes that feels perfectly natural. But here's the thing. The show was never called Sex in the City. It has always been Sex and the City. So why do so many of us remember the wrong title? A big part of the answer is how we actually experience language. Most of us first met the show by hearing it. Theme song, cast talking, trailers, conversations with friends. When people speak fast, words blur together. Sex and the City pronounced quickly starts to slur. The and the compresses, vowels shift, and what you hear can come out sounding like in the. That slurred spoken version lodges in your memory because oral language is how we process most of our day-to-day information. Sound shapes memory in a way that text doesn't. You can read the title correctly on a poster or streaming menu 1,000 times, but if your mental file for the show is built from sound bites, conversations, commercials, people saying it in passing, those sounds will govern what feels right. In short, your brain trusts the sound it heard more than the letters it saw. So when a mental snapshot is called up, that phantom title feels exactly like the original. This is why the Sex in the City misremembering spreads so easily. It's not a conspiracy or a mass failure of reading skills. It's the brain doing what brains do best, relying on the quickest, most efficient cue available. For many of us, that cue is auditory. We're wired to pass speech rapidly, often smoothing over little syllables like and the. Over time, that processed version becomes the one we recall. Try a tiny experiment the next time you're watching a clip. Say the title out loud, slow and deliberate. Sex and the City. Now say it fast. Feel how "and the" collapses into something almost indistinguishable from "in the"? That's the slip. It's human. It's common. And it explains why a wrong title can feel right. The letters never lied, but our ears and memories sometimes do. Take, for example, one of cinema's most famous misquotes. Everyone remembers Field of Dreams as the movie where the voice whispers, "If you build it, they will come." It sounds almost spiritual, a promise to communities, crowds, fans. But if you go back to the film, the line is actually, "If you build it, he will come." Singular, referring to one specific person, Ray Kinsella's father, the whole emotional center of the story. That shift from he to they feels small on the surface, but it matters. Once a line gets broadened by a parody, a t-shirt, or a headline, because the plural version has a nicer, more universal ring, the altered version spreads faster. People quote the version that matches their experience or what they want the quote to mean. I've caught myself doing it at dinner parties, quoting movie lines that fit the point I'm making, not the precise wording. And when 6 other people nod in agreement, the misquote becomes reinforced. Social proof wins. There's a reason the pluralized version stuck. "They will come" transforms a private, intimate promise into a public one. It turns a son's reconciliation into a civic rallying cry. It's more marketable, more meme-friendly. It's also easier to use in everyday life. You can slap it on a startup pitch, a community garden flyer, a concert poster. It feels inclusive and hopeful. Language is an emotional tool. People naturally reach for the version that carries more cultural weight. Psychology backs this up. Memory isn't a flawless recording. It's reconstructive. When we recall something, we fill gaps with context, expectations, and other people's versions. Media and repetition play huge roles. If you hear "they will come" in an ad, a headline, or a cover song, your brain prioritizes that repeated pattern over a single, accurate but less heard line. That's why entire groups of people can confidently remember events that never happened exactly as they recall, the so-called Mandela Effect. But it's less mystical than it sounds. It's social reinforcement and pattern matching. Relating it back to daily life, think about family sayings, office catchphrases, or a teacher's favorite aphorism. Chances are the version you grew up with isn't word perfect. It's the version your group used. I remember a quote my dad swore he'd said every Sunday, only to find the original line in the book was different. Yet the family version carried the emotional truth for us. That's the key. The misquote often feels more true than the original because it's been adapted to fit collective feeling. So what do you do with this? Don't panic about being wrong in casual conversation. Enjoy how language evolves and how culture reshapes meaning. But if accuracy matters, for work, scholarship, or respect for the original creator, take a moment to check the source. And when you realize you've been quoting "they" instead of "he", you get a tiny, neat insight into how we build shared narratives. We don't just remember, we remake. Chartreuse color confusion. The little color that causes full-grown people to argue in comments. I used to be one of those people. I remember standing in a department store with my sister, both of us squinting at the rack, convinced a dress was some kind of pink. She swore it was chartreuse. I pictured a dusty rose. Turns out the dress was a yellow-green that in daylight practically glowed. My memory had lied to me because the word didn't have a clear color parked in my brain. Why does that happen? A lot of it comes down to language. Chartreuse is a French-derived name, and in English we tend to borrow foreign-sounding endings and unconsciously assign them to the colors we already know. Words ending in use or use, like sounds, often feel floral or rosy to English ears. If you don't have a solid visual anchor for a word, your brain fills in the blanks using patterns it recognizes. If something sounds elegant, maybe it's a soft pink or purple. So people who haven't seen the classic Chartreuse swatch will guess based on how the word feels rather than on sight. There's another layer. When a color name lacks semantic grounding, meaning nobody shows you a clear example early on, memory and intuition take over. We're wired to link words to images. If Chartreuse wasn't part of your childhood vocabulary tied to a specific candy wrapper, jacket, or liqueur bottle, your best bet is aesthetic intuition. You'll think sounds floral, maybe pink, and that becomes your internal truth until you see the real thing. The internet fuels the confusion too. I can't count how many memes I've scrolled past where someone confidently claims Chartreuse is pink and 100 people agree. Design apps will show you the CSS color Chartreuse. Febreeze, a vivid yellow-green. But if you've only ever heard the word in passing, that hex code means nothing emotionally. Also, brands sometimes misuse color names in marketing, calling mustard golden Chartreuse or neon green electric Chartreuse, which muddies the waters for everyone. If you want a quick fix next time you feel your brain arguing with your eyes, try this. Save a swatch. Keep one Chartreuse sample, paint chip, fabric, or a bookmarked color code on your phone. When a name seems fuzzy, compare. That visual anchor will overwrite the guesswork. And don't be embarrassed if you've said Chartreuse and meant pink. Most of us have. Language and perception are messy friends. Knowing that makes the next mix-up a lot easier to laugh about. Froot Loops. The little rainbow rings that somehow anchored every Saturday morning. Plenty of people will swear with absolute confidence that the cereal was spelled Froot Loops, but it has always been Froot Loops. That tiny intentional misspelling trips up a lot of us, and the mistake tells us something interesting about how memory and reading work. I remember being a kid, hovering over the cereal aisle and assuming the box read fruit. It made sense, they're loops made of fruit, right? Years later, I reached for a box at a friend's house and did a double take when I actually read fruit. My first reaction was, oh, that's weird. Did they rename it? It felt like discovering a hidden typo in a childhood relic. Then I noticed the trademark, the playful logo, and realized the spelling was deliberate. When something looks deliberately misspelled, our minds often correct it back to a more logical form. We have strong expectations about how words should look and what they should mean. Fruit is a familiar, semantically rich word. Fruit is an odd shape that clashes with that familiarity. Because language processing relies on top-down predictions, the brain tends to restore what makes sense. So people read fruit as fruit without realizing it, and that corrected version gets stored in memory. Later, when asked, they're certain they remember fruit. Not because they're lying, but because memory is reconstructive, not like a video recording. Marketers know this. Using deliberate misspellings like fruit gives a brand a playful, trademarkable identity, but it also sits right at the edge of what feels normal. That tension is useful, it's memorable without being completely alien. The trade-off is that it invites our mental autocorrect. The more a logo resembles a familiar word, the more likely your brain will substitute the familiar word when you glance quickly. This isn't just a cereal thing. Think of other brand spellings or stylized logos you've mentally fixed. Did you ever read Krispy Kreme as Krispy Kreme in your head, or see Flickr and assume there's an E at the end? Those small deviations from spelling norms are designed to stand out, but they also trigger this automatic correction mechanism. And because most of us encounter logos in brief, context-heavy moments, a cereal box in the morning rush, a billboard on the highway, there's plenty of opportunity for the brain to substitute the expected version. So when you find yourself arguing that something used to be spelled a certain way, remember it's not necessarily stubbornness. It's your mind doing its job, making sense of the world by mapping new shapes onto familiar patterns. In the case of Froot Loops, our pattern-matching tendencies win out over Kellogg's trademark. The result is a surprisingly common memory mismatch that feels personal and convincing, because it literally is what your brain believes. The Volvo logo arrow. I've lost count of how many times someone, usually a friend who owns an older Volvo, has swore up and down that the badge used to be a plain circle with a diagonal line, no arrow. I believed it myself for a while. Then I started looking closely, on my dad's old Amazon, on a tiny key fob, on blurry photos from car shows. Every time, that arrow pointing up and to the right was there, quietly doing its job. It's always been part of the mark, but because it's small and integrated into the geometry, a lot of people mentally prune it away. That tendency is exactly what designers know and what most of us don't think about. Brand symbols are built from shapes we recognize: a circle, a slash, a serif. And when one element is less angular or less obvious, our brains simplify. In real life, you see the logo from a distance, on a grill that's been polished a dozen times, or as a worn sticker on a toolbox. A simplified version gets stored in memory. Volvo equals circle with slash. Later, when you picture it, your brain fills in a neat, minimal silhouette that often leaves the little arrow out. There's also the practical side. In some uses, embroidered jackets, small metal tags, low-res advertising, designers will intentionally minimize or crop details to preserve legibility. A car maker might reproduce the mark at sizes where the arrowhead would blur or snag on stitching, so simplified treatments get used more often. People see those simplified versions a lot more than the full badge. Over time, that simplified image feels more real than the original. That's where the false memory sets in. It's personal for me because I've done the same thing. I used to sketch logos from memory for fun, and I would soft pedal the tiniest parts. The subconscious prefers tidy shapes. It's not malicious, just human. And once a simplified version circulates, on a toy Volvo, an old poster, or a badly scanned PDF, that version acts like proof that the logo used to be different. Combine that with casual conversation and our tendency to trust shared recollections, and you get the perfect recipe for confusion. So when someone tells you the Volvo logo lost an arrow, they're not necessarily lying or wrong. They're remembering a simplified depiction that has been part of their visual diet. That small, easy-to-overlook arrow is a great reminder that brand identity lives at the intersection of design intent and everyday use. Little geometry, big implications, and a neat doorway into how we all misremember visual details more often than we think. CP30 or C3PO. How many times have you heard someone call him CP30? I used to laugh at that as a kid. That kid who could recite every line from A New Hope but still mangled an alphanumeric name. It's funny, but it's also revealing. That slip from C3PO to CP30 isn't random. It's a neat little window into how our brains store and retrieve names. Linguists call this phonetic transposition, an unconscious swapping or rearranging of similar sounds. When we hear a sequence that's mostly unfamiliar or lacks personal relevance, our brains prefer to smooth it into something easier to say and remember. C3PO is a string of letters, a hyphen, and a number. Saying it aloud, the sounds flop around and suddenly CP30 feels lighter on the tongue, even though it's technically wrong. The rhythm and consonant-vowel patterns get nudged until they match something our memory can more easily produce. This happens with other names too. Think of those moments when you call a coworker by the wrong name, not maliciously, just because the sound patterns are similar. Or when you read a street sign and your brain swaps syllables so it sounds more familiar. Names without personal meaning, characters you admire but don't know personally, brands you've seen 100 times but never used, are especially vulnerable. If a name hasn't been anchored to a face, a story, or an emotional context, memory prioritizes ease of pronunciation over strict accuracy. It's why people who meet a celebrity once can still get their name wrong. The name folded into the mind as a label, not as a lived detail. I remember correcting a friend who insisted on CP30 with a smug, movie geek flourish. He shrugged and said, "Does it really matter?" He had a point. For most conversations, the slight transposition doesn't change the story. But the slip teaches us about memory's shortcuts. Our brains are optimization machines. They minimize effort. When you encounter an unfamiliar label, the brain reorders vocal elements to reduce friction, quicker to say, easier to repeat. So next time you hear CP30, don't be annoyed, be curious. Ask yourself whether you actually care about the name's exact structure or if the label is just serving a conversational purpose. And if you're trying to remember something precisely, a username, a model number, a passcode, give it personal meaning. Attach a face, a story, a quirky mental image. The more meaningful the tag, the less likely phonetic transposition will sneak in and turn C3PO into something more comfortable but inaccurate. You probably heard it 100 times. Hello, Clarice. It's the shorthand for Hannibal Lecter meeting Clarice Starling. The thing is, movie trivia nerds and quote finders will tell you it's wrong. In the film, he actually says, "Good evening, Clarice." Yet the misquote refuses to die. Why? Because those two little words, hello versus good evening, do more than correct a transcript. They change the tone, and the version our culture prefers tells us something about how we remember feeling, not what was literally said. Think about the moment in the visiting room, the stark fluorescent light, the clear barrier between them, Clarice on edge and trying to be professional, Lecter calm, amused, and dangerous. Hopkins's delivery is surgical, measured, courteous, and quietly unnerving. Good evening, Clarice reads as formal, a top hat of civility placed over something feral. But hello, Clarice compresses all that into an intimacy that feels intrusive, like someone stepping straight into your skin. It's softer on the page, but somehow more corrosive in the imagination. That's why the misquote stuck. Our collective memory prefers what captures the mood rather than the literal line. Hello, Clarice has rhythm and intimacy. It's easy to parody, easy to drop into conversation, and it instantly telegraphs Lecter's unsettling mixture of charm and menace. It's a tiny narrative shortcut that saves us time. No scene setting required, just the unsettling greeting, and we all know the rest. I can relate to this on a personal level. The first time I saw the film, I left the theatre quoting what I thought I'd heard, feeling the same electric chill everyone talks about. Later I looked it up and realized I'd been misremembering. At first I felt a little foolish. Why hadn't my brain held onto the words correctly? But then I noticed how the misquote had crystallized exactly how I felt in that scene. Oddly intimate, strangely familiar, and absolutely wrong. Memory isn't just a recorder, it's an editor. It keeps what conveys the emotional truth and sometimes tosses the rest. There's also a practical side. Popular culture loves crisp labels. Hello, Clarice fits on a t-shirt, a meme, a late-night joke. It's repeatable. Good evening, Clarice is elegant but less clickable. Misquotes become memes because they're useful. They do the job of evoking a feeling, fear laced with flirtation, more efficiently than the precise line. So when we parrot, hello, Clarice, we're doing more than being lazy. We're participating in a cultural shorthand that chooses mood over precision. It's a reminder that films live twice, once in the theatre and again in the way we talk about them afterward. The line we remember often says less about accuracy and more about the way the story made us feel. And in the case of Hannibal Lecter, that chilling familiarity is the whole point. I used to shout one version of this line in the backyard, like it was a spell. Chances are you did too. It's one of those tiny, shared pop culture rights. Someone runs, someone else screams, and the moment becomes bigger than the movie. But here's the fun fact that trips people up. In the film, the kids are mostly yelling, "Forrest, run!" The dramatic, three-word punctuation we all hear in parodies, "Run, Forrest, run," actually shows up far less often on screen. Why does that matter? Because our memories are lousy editors. We tend to pick the punchiest phrasing and let it replace the original. The longer, more cinematic, "Run, Forrest, run," sounds like a line written to be shouted in a montage, so it's what gets lifted into sketches, ads, and stand-up bits. I can't count how many times I heard comedians and late-night hosts use the elongated version. They weren't trying to misquote the film, they were leaning into rhythm and drama. That repetition is why it lodged in so many of our brains. Think about when you remember a moment from a movie. It's not the verbatim line that sticks so much as the feeling. The shorter, Forrest, run, is almost functional. Someone urgently telling Forrest to get away. The other one turns the moment into spectacle. Once parodies and trailers started favoring the spectacle, that's the version that spread. The meme economy loved it. The phrasing is punchy, easy to mimic, and works as shorthand for any sudden sprint. You say it, and everyone gets the joke. I felt that shift, personally. I grew up repeating the longer line because everyone around me did. It became less about Forrest and more about the idea of running itself, an anthem for getting away from trouble or for dramatic athletic triumphs. Later, when I re-watched the film, I noticed the difference and laughed. My brain had been filling in extra drama for decades. This tiny, misremembered line is actually a great example of how pop culture reshapes itself. A few parodies, a couple of late-night jokes, and suddenly the collective memory edits the original film. It's comforting in a weird way. The community picks the version that best serves the feeling it wants to carry forward. That small shift in wording isn't just trivia, it shows how meaning gets amplified by repetition. Next, we'll look at how other lines in the same movie have been similarly morphed by covers, ads, and the internet, and why some exact quotes survive intact while others get rewritten by the crowd. Noah's animals, 2 or 7? That question, 2 of every kind or 7, is a small detail that says a lot about how stories live in our heads. I grew up with the tidy image, a big wooden ark and animals marching in 2 by 2, a zebra next to a giraffe, a pair of elephants lumbering aboard. It's a picture so crisp it feels obvious. But when you actually look at the text, the picture gets messier. Genesis gives us both images. One verse says God commanded Noah to bring 2 of every living creature, male and female, so life could continue. A few verses later, another command appears. Take 7 pairs, or 7 of the clean animals, and a pair of the unclean, depending on the translation. Why the discrepancy? Part of it is about categories the ancient authors cared about. Clean animals had cultic and dietary significance. They were suitable for sacrifice and later became the basis for kosher rules. So asking for extra clean animals wasn't a random quirk. It made sense in a world where ritual practice mattered. But there's also another layer, how we remember stories. Collective memory loves simplicity. When a tale is told and retold, details compress. The mind prefers a clear, repeatable image, 2 of each, because it's easy to picture and to pass on. It's like the childhood telephone game, the long explanation of clean versus unclean, 7 pairs for ritual reasons, can shrink into pairs. Over centuries, that compressed version becomes the dominant one in culture, art, and children's books. I think about my own family storytelling. How my grandparents always trimmed the odd, complicated bits out of anecdotes until what remained was an archetype. Maybe that's why Noah's animals often come down to 2 by 2. It's not that the deeper, messier text vanished. It's that memory scopes the story into what's most useful or memorable for the community telling it. This also shows how interpretation and memory interact. Different translators and religious traditions emphasize one reading over another. Some see the 7 as a way of preserving sacrificial continuity. Others read it as a later editorial layer reflecting evolving ritual lore. And for most people, none of that matters when the image is so powerful and portable. So when you picture Noah's Ark, it helps to hold 2 truths at once: the reassuring simplicity of pairs and the textual complexity that explains why some animals were counted differently. Both say something about human memory, how we make stories manageable and meaningful, and both lead to a fun but practical question. If Noah really took that many animals, how on earth did they all fit and survive on a boat? Location of New Zealand. Think about the last time you looked at a world map. maybe on your phone or that faded poster in a classroom. Do you clearly see New Zealand sitting southeast of Australia, or is it swimming vaguely off to the right, up and a bit northeast? If you find yourself picturing it in the wrong spot, you're far from alone. A surprising number of people remember New Zealand as being northeast of Australia, and that slip out of place tells us something honest about how brains tidy up the messy world. Here's the thing, our internal maps aren't exact replicas. They're compressed, simplified sketches meant to get us from A to B in everyday life. Psychologists call this mental map compression. Instead of keeping track of every angle and mile, we save landmarks and silhouettes. The boot of Italy, the stretched shape of Australia, the American continent as a big block, and the rest gets squished into familiar patterns. Tiny islands, distant southern neighbours, and subtle bearings are the first victims of that simplification. New Zealand is a bit of a casualty, small, far from densely populated routes, and often shown near the edge of many world maps. That nudges it into the wrong mental corner. I remember confidently telling a friend on a road trip, New Zealand is up and right of Australia, only to have them laugh and point out the map on their phone. I felt a mix of sheepishness and curiosity. How did I get that wrong? It wasn't ignorance so much as my brain's lazy shortcut. I'd anchored Australia as a big, central shape, and then placed New Zealand in the nearest recognizably map-like spot. Turns out, my memory had rescaled and rotated parts of the globe without asking me. Another contributor is how maps themselves are presented. Many pop culture maps crop or center the Pacific, which shifts relative positions in our heads. Add a mental bias that favors north-up orientation and familiar continental outlines, and you get this predictable displacement. It's not just funny trivia, it's a neat peek into how we perceive space. If you want a quick fix to make the real geography stick, try a tiny visualization trick. Imagine Australia as a vast, sunburnt kangaroo reclining, and New Zealand as a small, curious kiwi hopping off its southeastern paw. Or, when you glance at a world map, tilt your perspective so the Pacific is centered. Seeing both in relation rather than as edges helps your brain encode the true southeast position. These little mistakes aren't embarrassments so much as reminders that perception is constructed. Once you notice the bias, you'll start catching other subtle misplacements in your mental atlas, and that makes looking at maps a lot more interesting. You probably remember that tiny, trembling voice asking for connection. E.T. phone home. It's one of those lines that gets replayed in impressions, parodies, even carved into the way we talk about homesick feelings. But here's the twist that surprises people when I tell it at parties. The line as originally recorded on set, the awkward, slightly clipped version, was actually E.T. home phone. That little flip feels wrong instinctively. Why? Because our everyday English expects the verb to come before the object when someone is calling. Phone home reads like a command, a tidy, familiar rhythm. Home phone tacked onto ET sounds like a label, as if ET were an appliance with a model name. Yet that was what made it into the performance at first, a non-native-like syntax that felt off but also oddly earnest. What happens next is the part that makes this more than a filmmaking footnote. It shows how culture edits language for us. Audiences didn't just shrug and accept the line. Over time, repetition, in kids' imitations, late-night jokes, merchandising, and eventually internet memes, flipped the phrase into the smoother, more grammatical E.T. phone home. The community of speakers corrected the awkward original by sheer force of use. It became the version we teach our kids, the version we quote when we're feeling sentimental, and the one that shows up in every pop culture reference. I remember being 7 and trying to mimic E.T.'s voice into a toy rotary phone, elongating the vowels and pausing like I thought aliens might. Every kid on the block did. None of us said E.T. home phone. It would have never rolled off the tongue. That shared misremembering isn't an error so much as collective sense-making. We rearrange what we hear to match patterns that fit our speech rhythms and expectations. There's a gentle lesson in that tiny evolution. Language is alive, not only in dictionaries but in playgrounds, kitchen tables, and comment threads. A single awkward line in a big movie can be smoothed by millions of mouths until the corrected phrase becomes the memory. It also shows how meaning and emotion get prioritized over literal transcript. The heartbreaking request for connection is the thing we hold on to, and we frame it in words that sound as heartfelt as the moment felt. So when you hear someone quote, "E.T. phone home," don't think of it as misremembering, think of it as collaboration across decades. An audience polishing a line until it fits the way we speak and feel. It's a tiny example of cultural repair, an awkward syntax fixed by affection and repetition, turning a clumsy phrase into a piece of shared language and a shorthand for the ache of wanting to belong.